Good morning and welcome to the latest installment of the Urban Land Institute's Women's Leadership Initiative Build Up Breakfast Clubs. I'm Shannon Sclafani. I head up ULI Michigan, and I am so pleased to have all of you joining us this morning as we continue these really in-depth conversations. Today's topic is around equitable housing solutions, and I'm really excited to dig into this topic with all of you. We've got a couple of really talented professionals who are here to have this conversation, tell you about the work that they're doing, talk about the different policies and roadblocks and things that are coming up in the equitable housing world. And so I will introduce them shortly, but first, we are so lucky to have a couple of sponsors with us. So I am going to give each of them just a couple of moments to tell you a little bit about the impactful work that they do. First, we have Lisa Burden, who is the founder and principal with Lynchpin Legal.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Burden. As Shannon said, I'm the founder and principal CEO, sort of chief cook and bottle washer of Lynchpin Legal. We do entirely commercial business transactions work for nonprofits and for-profits, including commercial real estate developers. My specialty area is commercial real estate, and in particular, complicated alphabet soup tax credit financing, tax increment financing, et cetera, for complicated projects. So should you ever have the need for that, I welcome you to reach out to me. And just as a side note, the reason it's called Lynchpin is because my goal is not to get in the way of a transaction. Everybody wants a deal to happen. My job is to make it happen as seamlessly as possible. So thank you, and I'm very excited about this topic.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And next, we are so pleased to be joined by Melinda Clemens, who is the Vice President at Enterprise Community Partners and runs the Detroit market.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and a pleasure to be here. If you have not heard of Enterprise Community Partners before, we are a national nonprofit affordable housing organization. And so we really think about our work as a three-legged stool. So the first leg of that stool is capital. How do we provide loans for our developers to complete their affordable housing transactions? And that can be many different sources of capital. We have a CDFI that does community facility lending. We also have an investment firm that syndicates LIHTC transactions, and we have a mortgage company that provides HUD 221, Freddie, Fannie type loans. So really the entire spectrum of lending needed to complete affordable housing or mission-related projects. The second aspect of our work is our programmatic work and our solutions. We really try to come up with programs that complement our affordable housing work, knowing that a house is just the bedrock of stability. You really need other things to advance your economic mobility opportunities. And so we have 11 offices nationwide, and Detroit opened in 2015. And in Detroit in particularly, we're focused on how do we provide resources to our community development organizations, and how do we preserve our work with the city of Detroit and keep the units that we have affordable. If you guys know Stacey Esbrook, who is on our team, she is leading that work and she's doing an amazing job. Please reach out to her for more information. And then the last aspect of our work is policy. And so we have a presence in Washington, but what a lot of people may not realize is that we also, every office has a director of state and local policy. And so while we're advocating on a national federal level, each market is also advocating on a local level. And in Detroit, this year we're focusing on tenant right protections, as well as land contracts and community land trusts. So that is our entire package. If you want more information, please reach out to me or someone on the team or Shannon, and I'd love to tell you more. Thank you for having me today.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Melinda. Okay, so I am so pleased to introduce you to the two women who are going to be leading the conversation today. I know both of them personally, and I find both of them to be just both personally and professionally very inspiring women. So I know that all of you are going to have an incredibly energizing morning. We are so pleased because what we have found to be really impactful is, finding two women who can come on and, we're just really overhearing a conversation. We're going to listen in on a conversation between two incredibly smart people who are passionate about equitable housing solutions and initiatives, and are really going to get some insight into what's happening in that space, and where all of us can sort of lean in as well. And so it's my pleasure to introduce you to Kimberly Driggins, who is currently working as the executive director of the Washington Housing Conservancy in Washington, D.C., and Jess Zimbabwe, who is the executive director of Environmental Works in Seattle. Both are working currently on equitable housing solutions in their own market and understand sort of what is happening nationally in this space as well. So I'm so excited to welcome them to the conversation. Jess and Kimberly, I pass the torch to you.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Jess, I'm gonna let you go first.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Kimberly, I feel like in some ways this is cheating because I just wanted to catch up with you. And then when they asked us to give this, I was like, oh, great. I get to hear about Kimberly's new job and what she's up to. And the only differences would be that if it was just you and me, there wouldn't be all these other people, which is maybe weird, but it's great to have everybody else here and hopefully we'll get good conversations and questions there. Maybe we do it at a later time of the day and I'll be drinking something stronger than coffee. And I would maybe try and drop more curse words so it was just you and me, but I'm going to try and keep it like morning, civil. We're going to talk about equitable housing, but I'm really excited to be talking with you and hearing about your new work. And both of us have started new jobs since we last hung out together in person, which I can't remember if it was in Detroit or in DC when you were back one time from Detroit visiting DC.
I don't remember because I saw you a lot. I saw you a lot when I was in Detroit, so yeah. It all starts to blur after a while. So great. Well, I feel the same way. It's great. Thank you, Shannon and Victoria, for organizing this event. And I mean, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here talking with all of you. I think Jess and I are going to probably talk a little bit about our new organizations. And then get into some conversation around equitable housing. I think it's interesting. I mean, it's a very sort of buzzwordy, but it's really, for me, like providing affordable housing options for everyone in the communities that we're working in, and making sure that we're thinking about access and thinking out of the box with respect to housing, because I think we all can agree that there's not enough affordable housing, and certainly there's not enough tools to produce to produce the housing, which is part of the problem. So part of my new job is really thinking about innovation in the housing space. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Jess to go a little bit to give you a little overview of her organization.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. But I also just wanted the idea of equitable housing that they've asked us to speak about. I mean, it is a subtle distinction between, because there is just a point of more affordable housing would be more equitable, right? But there's also maybe like an overlay of it of a housing strategy and housing policies and housing solutions. I like the way that Enterprise breaks those three buckets down. So the capital and the solutions and the policy all feeding each other. But that the housing, financing and solutions and policy that also reflect that we know that housing has not been delivered equitably for decades, for generations. right? And so in addition to just providing more affordable housing, how do we do it knowing that, you know, planners and housers, the you know, in people's lifetimes, many other people who had the toolkits that we have did great disservice to neighborhoods and making in cities and making them more inequitable. And so we've got to undo that in addition to just providing more affordable housing across the board too.
I totally agree. I couldn't agree with you more. I think at the heart of the issue, it is a supply.
Yep.
It is a supply issue, but I do agree that policy, you have to think about it at all different levels to increase the supply. You have to look at zoning. You
Yep.
have to look at, you know, I know Melinda talked about tenant rights,
Yep.
you know, pushing for tenant resident rights. I think you're looking at it not just the construction of that unit of housing, but what are the policies, the tools that create and expand the supply.
Yep.
But I also, I mean, I hope we'll get far enough into the conversation that it's not a blanket, it's not a one size fits all solution. And I know with some of the tenant rights policies, DC is being looked at by many major cities and smaller cities because we have, you know, DC is a great example actually because we
Yeah.
have a lot of things on the books. And
The
you know,
TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, and the
DOPA, District Opportunity to Purchase Act. I mean, we have all of it. We have the, you know, inclusionary zoning. You know, we're looking at ADUs. I mean,
right.
I don't think you're going to find a city that has more tools. Yet we're probably arguably one of the cities that's most the housing affordability is one of the number one issues in the region.
Yep.
So even with all of those tools, somehow we're not meeting the demand and the challenges.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, so I think you put together a couple slides about your new organization, which I'm looking forward to seeing. I put together a couple too, so I can go through those and tell you a little bit about Environmental Works, where I'm at. So we're coming at housing mostly from the design side of things, which is a crucial component of the supply of housing, and thinking thoughtfully about innovation in design. So this is where I work. I just started January 1st as the new executive director here at Environmental Works Community Design Center. We are based in Seattle, Washington. That the building there actually, I'll show you a picture. The building that we're in front of is our historic firehouse that our offices are located in. Not that we're in offices, we're all working from home right now, but so Environmental Works is 51 years old. It was founded on Earth Day in 1970 by some architecture students and recent graduates from the University of Washington Architecture School. And they were running programs, working for community groups to, solve problems in the community. And then they were operating and started squatting actually in the firehouse that we now occupy as our home to stop it from being razed, to make way for an expanded parking lot for the grocery store that's next door. In a bit of sweet irony, or bittersweet irony, the grocery store, which is still next door to our firehouse office, just closed last month. It's a Kroger chain, and they closed it basically in protest for the city of Seattle passing mandatory emergency pay increases for essential workers like grocery store workers. So it's a bummer that they closed it. It's a real bummer for the workers and for the neighborhood to lose a grocery store. But in some small ways, I sort of feel like we beat them out because we're still here 50 years later after they tried to raise our historic firehouse. So we have different studios in the office that we're organized around. We do a lot of housing, and we do a lot of multifamily housing, affordable housing, housing with tribal partners, permanent supportive housing, workforce housing, farm worker housing. We have a landscape architecture studio, so we do a lot of public space and public realm projects. We do a lot of community facilities, childcare, early learning, senior centers, food banks, tenant improvements for social service providers. And then we do some special projects. A lot of those are rehabilitations to make accommodations for people with multiple disabilities to be able to live in a non-institutionalized setting. So we do a lot of renovating single-family homes to make them into small group homes, for instance. Our model is really committed to the community design process. So we do a lot of interactive design workshops. This is a project that we are about to start construction on, which is multifamily affordable housing for the Ethiopian community in Seattle, with the nonprofit Ethiopian Village ULI project. And so this is a sort of workshop that we did with them about what the building would look like. This is an example of one of our permanent supportive housing, which is a product type we've done a lot with. We are actually conducting right now a post-occupancy evaluation of a number of permanent supportive housing projects, one of which we designed and some of which were designed by other architects, trying to figure out what are the design features of permanent supportive housing that can best support the program operators who help folks get out of homelessness into units of their own. And then this is an example of some farm worker housing. Most of our work is in the sort of urbanized Puget Sound or in and around Seattle, but we do some work in rural parts of Washington State. This is a project we did with the Washington Growers League for seasonal farm worker housing in communities where folks are coming in for agricultural work. And then we do the site planning and permitting with our partners at the Low Income Housing Institute for their tiny home villages, which is a growing housing type. City of Seattle has been really supportive of this and set aside funding and land for it. And importantly, the city council just passed here a bill that would provide a property tax break to any property owner of a vacant property who allowed it to be used as a tiny home village for some, interim use before something can get built on it, to try and encourage people who are sitting on property for a few years to get that back into utility. So this is one small tiny home village that we did. Most of them average between 30 and 50 units in size. We just did one with the Puyallup tribe in Tacoma, Washington. But Lehi's been a great partner, and they have a great model that's about self-governance within the village. So we work with them and trust their model a lot and help them with the physical design and site planning and permitting needs for there. And that's a photograph of what one of those tiny home villages look like. They have some shared facilities, but they're mostly just these tiny homes. And there's a picture of our fire station that we operate out of, Station 7, and that's it.
Great. That's a really good overview. I'm going to share a few slides and then really want to get into the conversation because I know that our time is short. But just to give, I guess, a baseline overview. And I think it's worth noting that both you and I are urban planners. And, I think it's really interesting. My background, I spent 3 years in Detroit, really understanding, a very different city than DC. And it was really a great experience because it was very humbling. And I needed to abandon some of the things that I thought I knew around what worked because Detroit was a really different place. And I think that that's one of the things around equitable housing and just, really you come in with a set of skills and experiences, but you always have to understand the local context for what you're doing for the work. And so, we definitely did that. I certainly had to learn a lot, and there was a different set of issues around housing. I think it was about sort of the market and what the market would support, and also sort of the subsidy given, some of the conditions and where Detroit was at the time. I boomeranged back to Washington, D.C. after being away. And, it was a conscious decision by the board to hire someone that was not a houser. I was very honest. I was actually a little surprised that they were interested in me because my career has not been in the trenches of creating affordable housing, but more at a macro level, really looking at urban development, revitalization throughout the course of my career. And I think that in our title, the Washington Housing Conservancy, it signals something different. And they're certainly very capable affordable housing experts in DC, but they were really looking for someone who could think about cross collaboration, who could think about what's missing in the gaps. And we're housing plus opportunity. We're really working, we're a very targeted intervention, the Washington Housing Conservancy. We were established in 2018. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit. We aim to preserve, we are preservation, meaning we buy existing apartment buildings. We're not, I wouldn't say that we would never do new construction, but we are really thinking about, it's always easier to preserve what is already there than to create new. You need and both, not either or. So I'm not advocating for one or the other, but I do think preservation in this conversation is sort of the less sexy work. And we really focused in on that because it's quicker. You don't have to go through zoning. And what we were trying to do, we're focused on preserving affordable housing, avoiding displacement, promoting economic mobility, particularly for moderate to low income African Americans and other residents of color. So there's a lot here, but I will say as I go, a couple of key things. Preservation, looking at existing housing. We're in the naturally occurring affordable housing space, or NOAA space. This is the market rate affordable. This is where it's affordable today, but rents are escalating and it's unprotected. There is no government subsidy unless it's the actual resident that has the tenant voucher, but this is not project based. So this is what's being lost in the market, no matter where you live. This is the housing that's being lost at the greatest rate because there is no protection, and it goes to the private sector 9 times out of 10 as a value add. And so I'll talk about how we're promoting economic mobility. The focus on moderate to low income, it's intentional that I'm using moderate to low income. We actually are focusing on workers. It's called workforce housing. I don't particularly like that term because I think everybody's working, no matter what income class you are. But it's really, looking at people who earn too much to qualify for subsidized housing, but their incomes aren't keeping up with the cost of living in the area. So these are your teachers, your firefighters, your nurses, your first responders. It could be, it's hospitality workers that's been hit really hard in the pandemic. It's folks, again, that make a quote unquote decent living, but are being pushed further and further from where their jobs actually are. We are a mixed income model. So we have low income and we have market rate, but our sweet spot is the quote unquote workforce. And that's by design. We believe in mixed income communities. Everything that we do will always have a mix of incomes. We believe that that makes the most dynamic and thriving communities. Just a couple of things here, and I'll speed up because I know that Jess has a ton of questions, and so does the audience probably. But again, we have a social impact investing vehicle. We don't, we really don't compete with traditional affordable housing providers. We don't use low-income housing tax credits. We don't use housing production trust fund monies. We don't use HUD Section 108. We don't compete. We are additive. One could argue that we compete for philanthropic dollars. That's true. But we're not tapping those scarce resources that are really needed to produce the most affordable or at affordable housing at the lower end, at the lowest end. We don't take away from those resources. I'll talk about the social impact investing vehicle in a few minutes. We're looking to promote housing stability in service of economic mobility. We have our whole theory of change is that, what does not being overly rent burdened allow an individual or a family to do? We hope that it allows them to save. We know that home ownership is still something that a lot of people want. So maybe it's offering financial literacy. Maybe it's thinking about daycare. We know that daycare is the second highest expense. Maybe it's thinking about workforce development. We're doing some innovative partnerships with Urban Alliance and some other folks around workforce development. So we have a whole suite of options, but we're going to have residents actually tell us. That's another thing that we have a co-creation model, and residents are actually going to drive what we do on the social impact side. So we use private sector capital that's flexible, and we compete with not for-profit entities to preserve housing. these are some of our core operating principles: advancing racial um, equity and inclusion. That's first and foremost. I'll talk a little bit, since that's really the topic, how we look at that. That's really thinking about systemic racism in housing, in urban development, and trying to mitigate um, and constantly think about the ways in which systemic racism plays out in housing, from where we're looking at buying our properties, and I'll show you a map, to how we train property management staff. We have an inclusive property management track. We are committed, me as the executive director and the board, to advancing racial equity and inclusion. It's not just words, but really thinking about how we operationalize that. Universal quality, that's pretty obvious, given the work that you do, Jess, I'm sure you know. But this is really, this is housing that any one of us would want to live in, feel proud and feel good about living in it. Maximizing resident choice and voice. This is really key. This is really at the building level. How it's an invitation to participate in a WHC community. We call it a partner community, emphasis on partner. And how can we be more transparent in our decision making? How can we share in some of those responsibilities? And how can we direct our resources to make sure that it's really meeting the goals and the needs of the residents? And that's, some people are like, oh, I would never do that, but that was really important to the team. If we're really going to talk about how we're different, thinking about that. And the others are pretty self-explanatory. This slide, spend a little bit of time here. This is our theory of change. And essentially you have in the middle, the gold, is the North Star around housing stability and economic mobility. What's in the teal blue, it's where and how we work. High opportunity neighborhoods, I'll define that in 1 minute. Mixed income housing, I talked about that. So those are like, the pillars that will never change. The dark blue, these are the 4 key strategies. And I'll talk about that, like each of them in 30 seconds, but these are the 4 key strategies in which we are moving our theory of change. And what's outside is really the systems change: preventing displacement, more inclusive communities, more equitable systems. These are the 3, there's more, but these are the 3 big systems change pieces that, when you put it all together, what we're trying to change. The core social impact strategies, a lot of these are fairly self-explanatory, but I did want to focus on a couple. The inclusive property management, it's really, this is something that I really knew nothing about. But we are working with the National Initiative for Mixed Income Communities, NIMC. They're based in Case Western Reserve. Dr. Mark Joseph, Salin Givergis, a former HUD official under the Obama administration. They have been key advisors to the Conservancy on the strategy, and combined, they have over 30 years of experience working with mixed income communities and doing work. They just won a HUD Neighborhood Choice Grant, as did Detroit, so shout out to Detroit. They also won one, I think, for 35 million. So they deeply experience in what works. Trusted Spaces is their partner on inclusive property management. It's really around how we're treating tenants / residents. I say residents more than I say tenants. And really thinking about that a property manager's job is more than just fixing the light in the unit and collecting rent, but how are they stewards of the space, and how are they providing and contributing to a welcoming environment at all levels? We know that best practice has shown us that inclusive mixed income models, people at the lower end there's some othering that can occur with mixed income. We've seen that in Hope 6, we've seen that in HUD Neighborhood Choice communities, and we know that can happen. So it's an intentionality around how we're supporting our residents and making sure that we're maintaining the buildings at the highest level, and we're creating opportunities for residents to truly meaningfully engage. Just because you're living next door doesn't mean you're interacting.
That's right.
So placemaking, that's something that I have a deep expertise in, a love for. I insisted that it be there. People wanted to put that under community building. I was like, no, it's different. And it's really around, the spaces. I mean, this is a lot of the work that I did when I was in Detroit, Spirit Plaza, some of the other things, but it's really about how are we creating intentional shared spaces that foster a deeper sense of place, cultural preservation, and well-being. That is very much the built environment. The community building is the resident to resident, resident to property manager interaction, and how are we promoting, it's very important, equally as important. I give equal weight to all four of these, but it's really technology. We're on the, we're thinking about technology on the front end, not the back end, around how residents communicate, and human capacity and wealth building. I mean, I could speak all day about all four of these, but these are four critical pillars. I talked about this, but promoting, this is the key, human capacity and wealth building for the economic mobility piece. This is the linchpin around educational advancement, self-sufficiency, self-determination. Like, what are those services and supports and experiences that promote economic mobility? It's a lot. We are ambitious. I don't do anything small. And this is the long game. All of our buildings will have a social impact strategy. I'm going to move a little faster in the interest of time. Just how we work. So we work in the DMV. What you see on the left, on my left anyway, is the map. The dark blue blobs are where the Conservancy is working. They're characterized by the following, and you see it on your screen: above average population growth. This is 50% or higher. So we're really focused on where the bleeding is the heaviest, so to speak, around displacement, right? One could argue this whole map should be dark blue. I don't necessarily disagree, but it's 50% or higher. So we wanted to quantify what we meant by population growth. Proximity to jobs and transportation, you can see that this is very TOD oriented, biased. We know that affordability along quality transit is the first to go. So it's intentional. Looking at where there's large rental housing stock, these are already mixed income areas, and these are already areas where private investment is driving change. And we know that where you live, zip codes impact outcomes. We know that. Raj Chetty, before him, decades long. I don't have to go through that, but these are some statistics about life outcomes based on zip codes and where you live. We know that it's a key determinant. It's a little bit about our structure. I run the not-for-profit. The Housing Conservancy is a not-for-profit owner and operator of the real estate. We have a fundraising goal of 30 million. We've raised 18.5 to date. That's funds raised, not cash on hand. The impact pool is managed by JBG Smith. JBG Smith is the largest real estate developer in the region. And we could not do what we do without them. They are a critical partner. They manage the investment fund. It's a 7% return, capped return to investors. We've actually closed out the fund. We closed it out a little bit early, and we closed it out at 120, 125 million. That fund provides mezzanine financing. So what our capital stack looks like is typically our first mortgage is a Fannie Freddie. The mezzanine or second debt financing is the impact pool money. And then the gap, the 10% that's left, 10% or less, the Conservancy has an equity requirement. So we put in up to 10% equity in all of our real estate deals. Now, there's a combination. Sometimes we get, we have real estate tax exemption. There's some things that are at play at a policy level that we take advantage of to lower some of the cost of capital, but that's essentially what the capital stack looks like on most deals. And we're going to be establishing a stakeholder council later this year. I want to just go down to the Amazon deal. So Amazon Crystal House is our first project. It's in National Landing, or Crystal City for those who've been around a long time. It was a market rate building. This was very atypical, but Amazon is an atypical partner. I talked about our capital stack and how the first mortgage typically represents 70% of the deal. In this case, it was 97% or 96.5. Amazon came in as a senior lender here, and they provided a mortgage product to us that was well below market. We can't disclose the number, but it was less than 3%. So it's the cheapest money that you're ever going to find, that we were ever going to find. And it enabled us to do the deal. It was a $378 million project. We are taking a market rate luxury building and we're transitioning it to affordability. 75% of the 825 units, so that's 619 units, will be dedicated affordable for 99 years. That's for incomes of 85,000 or less. 20% of those units will be for incomes earning 50% of AMI, area median income, or less. This is huge. This is a block away, literally a block away from Amazon's new headquarters and national landing. We were leveraged 60 to 1. We also received a grant from Amazon, in addition to the $378 million, a $2 million grant to the Conservancy for emergency rent relief, $750,000. We have an contingency reserve in our model, and Amazon wanted to fund that upfront. And the balance for our social impact implementation. So the stuff that I was talking about just a few slides, I think that's really what got them to yes. They could have partnered with any number of quality not-for-profits in Northern Virginia and DC. They saw our ability to move really quickly. This deal was done in it was done in 2.5 months. Crazy. It was just ridiculous in terms of the time frame. And we have 15 million in capital investments planned for the building, about 5 million planned for this year. So we are who we say we are with respect to maintaining quality, and that's built into our pro forma. So I said a lot. I'm going to pause there and just have you, ask some questions, and let's get into a conversation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was great, Kimberly. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to see. I knew a little bit about what you all were doing in that one deal, but it was great to hear more of it. There was a question in the chat. I think you answered it about high opportunity neighborhoods, and you described it in the DC context. And I'll drop a link in a little bit onto the specific study that's here in King County that Raj Shetty was involved with about sort of moving to opportunity. But I wonder if we could start there and just talk about, you definitely identify as a placemaker. I guess I do too, right? I'm a designer. I care about quality place. But I think one of the challenges is like the purported idea that those are in tension, investing in places and investing in people, or that you can do one or the other, right? And that they have to be in concert with each other, because when you don't keep up with, when you invest in places without investing in people, that's when you lead to like a lot of gentrification and displacement. When you invest in people without investing in places, they're losing the resources of the place, and that especially as in terms of housing and the need to preserve that housing as it is. And keep access. So what if you could talk a little bit about how you think about that tension in your work? Or do you ever feel that people, you mentioned, was it, did you do a strategic plan with your board when you mentioned they tried to get you to fold placemaking under community building?
We had a social impact, we have a social impact committee that's made of some board members and then some experts in the field. We had someone from Enterprise, we had Mary's, we had not-for-profit executives that were outside of housing on our board, on our social impact committee. And so we had a social impact strategy that we developed. It's not really an operational plan for the organization, but we needed a strategy. The real estate model was really well thought out with me coming on board as the ED
Right.
in 2019. What wasn't thought out was social impact. Now, to the board's credit, they gave lip service, like we think it should be in there, but they didn't know like really how to operationalize that. So I saw as really one of my first responsibilities was to actually have the social impact catch up to the thinking, catch up to the real estate, because it needed to be integrated and it needed to be on par with the real estate. And I was like, okay, I'm someone who doesn't just talk about it, we have to be about it. So that's really, even before I started, is that we need language, and we need to define what we mean by social impact. That's another buzzword. Everybody's saying that, but what the hell does it mean? And so we needed to define it. So with respect to placemaking and the strategies, kind of leaning into my experience. And I think part of the reason, again, I think they hired me was because I wasn't singularly focused on housing. And for me, working at the building level, that's the smallest unit of measure I've ever worked on. I'm used to working neighborhood or city level. So I can't divorce who I am. I think about how the building relates to the block, to the neighborhood, to the city in which it's in. That's just in my blood. That's just how I'm wired to think that way. And so while my immediate focus is on the residents, in terms of the unit and measure, in terms of how we're defining success. Placemaking for me, is it a beloved park that's right near the building that residents go to that needs a little TLC, that needs, like, we're thinking about our investments, not just at the building level, but like, where are people going? And we're surveying them. Like, so it's not just, well, what do I think? It's like, we're asking the residents. So the consultants that we're working with, we're developing, we're coming up with surveys, thinking about how do we collect information and data? When do we collect it? Because we have to report out. We have some very specific metrics to report out on as we go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting.
So
and somebody dropped a link in the chat also to, there is a great ULI book a couple years ago, published by ULI, written by Henry Cisneros and Jeff Lubell, about building more equitable cities, that talks about high opportunity neighborhoods too. So that is a great resource that's there in the chat too.
I do want to clear up though, is that reason why I define what we mean by high opportunity neighborhoods is that it's not the same definition of Raj Chetty. That's not
right.
It's where ours is a different definition. We've actually used his data. We've overlaid his data and our definition, and there is some similarities, but it's not exactly the same.
Yeah.
And that was also one of the first things I was like, well, what do we? So I'm very clear to define what we mean by high opportunity neighborhoods, but it's not the Raj Chetty definition. There are some differences. So I just want to make sure that I'm on record.
Give me an example of one thing that's different about your model.
Well, I think that his model is driven more about like sort of the outcomes. Like he's already sort of studied, kind of the people and how they fared. And, he's defining it based on, I think, sort of a backward look. And we're defining it like on a forward looking basis, more kind of place-based. His is more like people and how people fared in those zip codes or census tracts. And so it's more backward looking. Ours is more forward looking.
That's right. That's interesting. But that your model is more akin to how households make their housing location decisions, right? You're not making a decision on where, if I had located here 20 years ago and had children, this is where I would locate. You're trying to think of what's going to be an opportunity going forward. Yeah,
absolutely. And we're also, again, very specific around the mitigating displacement. And so for us, it's really, where is the market pressure the greatest, and where is an intervention like ours going to be most needed, right? We don't have an infinite, like our goal is to acquire 3,000 units over the next 5 to 7 years. We have 825 units with this one building. Our typical is around 200, 250 units. Our next couple of projects are much smaller than the Crystal House project, one in Prince George's County, and we're looking at 2 projects in the district right now. The district's always longer because of TOPA, Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act. So we can't actually move as fast because of some of the processes.
The district is protecting tenants' rights.
Yeah. But I think you have a question in the chat from
there's a good question here about how design has driven programmatic outcomes in the housing that we help support. And I think that's a really good one. So I mentioned before that we're really committed to community design and, lifting up the innate human dignity of the end user. So we do a lot of user design workshops. in that. And we also are pretty choosy about our clients. So we work with exclusively nonprofit and public sector clients. And we increasingly have been working to support real ownership by BIPOC communities in and around Seattle. So we're working with the first AME Fame Equity Alliance on their first housing development that they're going to be in an ownership position on. And the design workshops with an organization like that are really intentionally about, helping them understand the program decisions about, the trade-offs that they're going to be making about the number of units, the types and quality of community spaces, but that those are their decisions to make because they're going to be in that ownership position over the model. So we, I showed some examples, some photographs from the workshop with the organization Ethiopian Community in Seattle, but we're also doing some housing with for affordable senior housing for LGBTQ seniors. And that project also specifically had a number of design features and some difficult conversations about the trade-offs involved with it. But we're really committed to helping our clients make informed decisions about the program of the spaces. If you have the units of this size, this is how many you can build in this square footage and it's a zoning envelope. And if you have units of that size, or if you devote this much space to community facilities, this is what's left. And I think it's can be difficult for people who aren't trained in design to see those trade-offs up front. So that's what we're really trying to happen in those design workshops, is to make the decisions that are much easier decisions to make earlier in the process understandable then, because in many ways for non-professional designers, it's hard to understand that until you sort of see it. But by that point, it's already, under construction, it's built, and it's a very expensive decision to undo. So we try and do a lot of that work up front, which can be real, it's multiple layers of meetings. It's not just like, here's a floor plan, this is what we're going to build. Okay, see you later. See you in, in a year when it's done. There's a lot of negotiations back and forth there. And we're really committed to that kind of design. There's a question here, Kimberly, that you don't tap into scarce public resources like tax credits. Other than philanthropic sources, what sources do you use for construction rehab? And yours isn't exactly philanthropic, it's a social venture, but the investors are still getting a return there. They're just getting a capped return. Is that right in your model?
So there's two, right? So
Yeah.
there it is philanthropic because we as a not-for-profit are raising funds. That's purely philanthropic. There's no return on investment. The social impact tool, social impact investing tool is providing the mezzanine debt. That is the return. And that's primarily banks, right? They fulfill their CRA credits. So the majority of the people in that social impact pool are larger institutions. I guess there's some individuals, but I know most the biggest are banks. Now, regarding my question, we don't do construction or rehab. So again, we're preservation, and we're looking at buildings that are actually already in decent shape. Yes, they need some. We have a CapEx plan.
You're not even doing rehabs when you take over a building.
No, we don't want to move people. We want people. So these are buildings that are in decent shape. Again, there's maybe some deferred maintenance, certainly. And, we've looked at what's needed during the due diligence period, during the financing, because the health of the building also drives some of the financing strategies, right? So this building that we're looking at in Prince George's County, it's a joint venture. This one is a joint venture. We're working with National Housing Trust, NHT, National Housing Trust Communities, for this project. And, it's interesting because they're going before their board this week on the deal. And it's so different. Like they'll do a NOAA deal, but they've never done a deal like this. And even the county that we're working with, we pushed the county to exercise its first right of refusal. So we talked a little bit about policy here. This is another space where we're pushing the envelope to try to create more to allow this to happen more regularly. Because if it were easy, everyone would be doing it. So this is something where we are really swimming upstream. I can tell you, just in terms of the number of deals we've looked at and evaluated, and some of the things that we've gone after, even being as well capitalized as we are, we can't go up like in these value add scenarios, private sector developers will often outbid, overpay because they're going to get that money back because they're going to jack up the rents. Where our model fundamentally isn't about escalating rents and pushing people out. It's actually keeping people in place and capping your rent and putting in affordability covenants where there were none. So yeah, I mean, in terms of our model, we don't work. We might do infill, and we have talked about partnering. So a lot of people are in the construction game, but if there's an opportunity to build out on the site, that's something that we can consider. But we would bring a partner in to do that. You know, I love that we're very clear. There's no kind of identity crisis with us. And there are plenty of people that do new construction of affordable housing very well. But it is those tools, right? Low income housing tax credit, all the things to do construction and rehab. I get that question all the time. That's not the business that we're in.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Really fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's hard because, you know, a lot of affordable housing has been done one way. You know, again, like the products sort of demand that. The financing tools demand that. And usually you need that. Usually you need that. Like when we were talking with National Housing Trust, they're like, yeah, usually we would need it to be somewhat more distressed so they could access something for rehab, right? Like, so, you know, and the county's like, yeah, this product, this mezzanine financing, talk a little bit about that, right? And, you know, we had to take some of the county's money because that's how they ensure that we're going to fulfill our affordability requirements, but we didn't ask for much because we didn't need it. So it really is a little different. Takes a little while for people to get their heads around the model.
That's great.
I wanted to say, because this is a Detroit-based audience for the most part, that, you know, people are like, well, you know, would it work in different cities? And I get that a lot. And it really would. And I think that, you know,
it would
in
work
Detroit,
here for sure.
Yeah, well, Seattle.
Yeah.
You guys have serious challenges around the housing affordability. And Amazon is making a lot of investments there. By the way, they have a $2 million equity fund. We were one of the marquee investments, but they were working with King County Housing Authority. They received a lot of money from them.
Microsoft also is doing a lot. Yeah. I mean, you know, those kind of companies drove a lot of change that created a lot of our housing. So yeah.
And that's actually the point I really want to make is that, you know, one of the things about Detroit that is really, they have a philanthropic landscape like no other. And I wish that I had the level of philanthropy in DC. We do not. It's actually something that I think Detroit could actually easily do, is set up like an entity or you know, modify an entity to kind of expand into this space. It is a coalition of the willing. You do need to think about, you know, the partners, the corporate partners. You've got, you know, Bedrock and Dan Gilbert. I mean, the level of corporate involvement and the level of philanthropy in Detroit, you need that to make anything move quickly in Detroit. And so you've got all of the sort of key ingredients to have a model like this in the Detroit market, is what I'll say.
Yeah. You know, and there is, Olga just dropped in the chat that there are challenges in Detroit too, right? That there's still economic inequity. It's just another layer of challenge that the income is lower overall. And so the financing is another level, another set of tools and a different set of partners.
That's exactly right, which means,
and the land values, right? Yeah.
Well, the land values, which means, you know, what the philanthropic sector or corporate sector would have to underwrite is greater. But we've seen them do that. We've seen Detroit do that with the strategic neighborhood fund. With like, they're already doing that for the most part in a lot of the neighborhoods. So it's not a stretch. But yes, the market is different. You know, the need is different. I'm not saying that they're exactly the same, but I do think it's possible. And the thing is, what Detroit has that Seattle and DC don't is it isn't there are pockets of like a white hot real estate market, but it's
Yeah.
not like throughout.
Yes.
It's very uneven in Detroit, right? Corktown, like 7.2, Jefferson Chalmers. I mean, like, where there's real like market pressure. So you can actually sort of, think about how you stimulate the market in areas, and then like where Corktown and Jefferson, like you probably would be very strategic in a model like ours around where you think the greatest pressure on the market is, but almost all of it is new construction too. I mean, so it's fascinating. I haven't really thought until this moment about how our model would play out there. It definitely wouldn't be exactly the same, but if people were really interested, I think something could be done.
Yep.
And I know in Seattle, again, the county, so where you are, and I know we're running out of time,
Yeah.
but
Well, there's also like all this other conversation in the chat, so I'm like ready to open it up. Everybody here
okay, yep.
So
Let's
go
do
ahead,
that.
finish your thought about Seattle.
No, I was just going to say that the county, my understanding is the housing authority in the public sector is really active in Seattle in ways in which, and active in a good way from my understanding around how they're pushing the envelope around housing affordability. So that's all.
Yep. That's great. And Shannon, I know we're at time, but I think we're going to stay and do some breakout conversations, or tell us what happens next.
Yeah, no worries. So typically we would go into our breakout rooms now to continue the conversation. But I think there's such an active, sort of voices in the chat that I'd hate to cut it off, as long as both of you are still available for the next few minutes to sort of keep going in this format.
I'm happy. I'd love to hear from Melinda also, because she's been doing some of this investing and raising capital in the Detroit market, and others.
Yeah,
I know too. So yeah, and I know Olga and Alexa, and there've been a lot of good comments in the chat. I'm just trying to catch up. Victoria asked you a very good question, Kimberly. If you had Detroit's philanthropic fundraising power in DC, would you use that in the model that you have, or would there be a different model then?
I would probably have already met my fundraising goals if I had the landscape. But I will say that national funders actually aren't funding housing like philanthropy. Now enterprise, certainly, obviously that's the business of enterprise. But it's just interesting. Like when I came in to the role, like Kresge, they're not funding housing. And so the issue is that it's what a lot of national funders like Ford, Kresge, and some of the others is that investing in housing and preserving the unit hasn't changed the trajectory of the people living in affordable housing, right? There's been a creation. It's like, what are you measuring? If you're measuring creation of units, okay, check. But if you're actually thinking about how do you lift people out of poverty, then you're actually thinking about more around the economic mobility piece, around investing in people to be able to raise their incomes, to be able to move. Again, it's an and both. I would say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I was like, you need housing, but you also need to invest in people to raise their skills, to raise their income. So I'd say that, local and funding and housing is very local, right? What you have the most success with, I think, local funders, because, it's very local. So Melinda, jump in, feel free, take it away.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that you said, right? That housing is, again, just the bedrock. It's really an economic mobility play. So we ask so much from our housing sources, right? We ask them to help with healthcare, right? Transportation, work, schools, like that. There is so much wrapped up in where you live that it is more than just infrastructure or just a unit count or a place for people to be housed. It is much more. And so that's how come it's so important to us. And we also are hoping that Biden includes it in the infrastructure bill. We certainly propose that and are looking forward to it. What I would say for Kimberly is that she is lucky that she is in DC because she has those higher rents and can actually get transactions done. The problems that we have here in Detroit is that our affordable housing needs so much CapEx that even with the philanthropic community, even with 9% tax credits, there's still a gap. And so if you do complete the project, you either have to get rid of those very important units that are below 30% AMI, people who are disabled on very low fixed income, all of a sudden they have to become 50 and 60% AMI. Or you just can't get the deal done because the gap is too wide and you've already used all your sources that you have. So we have a real challenge here in Detroit about how we can preserve our housing, but keep it affordable for the residents that are in it.
That's very true. I haven't been monitoring the chat, so you'll have to see what
No
else is
worries.
going
I'm trying to sort of weed through as well. Erin Bordelon had, I think, a really good question. Erin, do you want to come off mute and ask your question to the ladies?
Sure, I'm happy to. Let me pull it up so I can read it. I just was wondering if you have found an effective way to engage stakeholders, developers, the private investment community, in realizing the value that affordable housing has in their ESG strategies, climate risk, SDGs. Because I found like there's a move. I mean, I'm in sustainability and consulting and stuff, mostly in multifamily housing, a lot of affordable housing, but I found it's a lot easier to have conversations when it comes from the top or the institutional investors.
Yep.
However, whenever I am having conversations on a building level, which is very much where I play every day, there's not a lot of understanding or interest or even like knowing what I'm talking about, in all honesty. When I'm talking to project managers, development managers, construction people. I just wanted to see what your take is on that and how to engage and maybe ask the right questions to make sure that.
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. I mean, we have that, the Conservancy has that challenge. The corporate sector, they haven't been used to really thinking about housing affordability. I think in a market like DC, it's become an issue around recruiting, right? I will just say, it's always trying to figure out where the there is with corporate America and sort of like a win-win. In DC, the problem has gotten to be so acute. We're looking, if you're outside of the DMV, people don't realize that, it's not as bad as New York. It's certainly not as bad as California, but it's bad, it's super expensive, to live here. And, just based on some of the interviews I've done, there's a sort of, they're like, oh, we didn't realize the rents have, we've been on a upward trajectory for the better part of 25 years, yeah. In terms of strong growth. So now it's a regional competitiveness issue. It's a worker retention issue. Yeah. And again, the space that I'm in, the market rate affordable, I'm very clear that I'm not at the lowest end, that 30% or less AMI. I'm not in that space. But it is actually, the space where a Marriott, a lot of your workers fall into this, what we're trying to do. So we have a little bit of an advantage because our sweet spot sometimes syncs up with some of the corporations. With Amazon, they did something extraordinary. What they did, people ask, well, is it for their workers? It's not. I mean, of course, Amazon workers can live there, but they didn't ask for set aside number of units. We're actually trying to, and this is where Amazon is really interesting. They don't always, they're so used to negative press. And I don't want to debate that. There's good reason for that. But they're actually not so good at claiming where, you know, they've actually invested a lot. Like, we're not the only story. So I have actually found it surprising that they haven't leaned into, um, I think what they did was extraordinary. I would love every corporation to do something on the same side, like that's the size and scale appropriate for that corporation. And we would be more than halfway there. I will say the reason why is because they had local people. So Catherine
Yep.
Buell is a former colleague of mine in DC government. She ran St. Elizabeth's. She's the former public housing director of Atlanta. She understands housing. So part of it is who's in those corporations, who's
Yep.
in, like, you know, the more that you get placemakers or people who worked in cities. The former deputy mayor, Brian Kenner, he is at Amazon.
Yep.
Former deputy mayor for education, Victor Reynoso, he is at Amazon. So like Amazon, at least this go round, like HQ2,
Yep.
they actually realized the need to have people, government people, like that really understand the challenges of the region. And I'm only singling out those three because I worked with them personally. But that certainly helped the conversation because Amazon doesn't do housing. They just don't, they don't do it the way that they, you know, like, so the housing equity fund, like it's a big, big deal. I'm not just doing a, you know, a commercial for them, but like we've been in talks with them over a year. When I first started, we had been talking to them. But some of the players, Catherine came into the role last summer, and that certainly sped up the conversation, like, you know, about an investment. So
I think that's a great point. Just the identifying maybe in the corporate structure who is there or maybe who they need, and be those, connect with those people. That's a really great. I appreciate that, Kimberly. Thank you.
And Enterprise has a leaders group in DC that David Bowers leads, Housing Funders Network or something like that. That's actually focused on corporate America. Like, you know, we just can't meet the challenges by ourselves in our silos. Government can't meet it. Intermediaries like Enterprise can't meet it alone. Like, it really, it's all boats. We're really, I mean, the sooner we get that as like in a region, in a place, like you just cannot meet, you know, Detroit has very distinct, unique challenges. You need everybody rowing in the same direction.
Right.
Same with DC.
Yep. And I agree. I don't want to harp on the bad press of Amazon either, because I do think they're getting there and these projects and investments are great. But I think it was maybe a little bit the bad press that like they're playing catch up, right? They're responding a little bit to some pressure that they got about the Queens deal that went south. And so maybe that can be, you can use that as an illustrative story to not have to play catch up, right? To talk more proactively about when you put a number of jobs and investments in a place, what are the concomitant sort of other investments that need to happen at the same time. So I think they're doing a great model at that we could highlight elsewhere. Yeah.
And I think that you're right. They learned that they needed to do a little bit better, being a good neighbor, what that looks like, experience. You know, hindsight's always 2020. Sometimes you don't even learn the lesson. I give them credit for wanting to do things differently. But the initial question that person asked, and she's off screen now, about it's tough. Like, I'm not going to lie to you. It is tough to create a value proposition for corporate America to invest in affordable housing. And, you know, I would welcome an opportunity to work with anybody on this panel about ways to message. It's tough.
Yep.
Very tough.
There's another question. I know you had asked it before. We talked about it very little bit. The difference between affordable housing and equitable housing. I mean, we could talk about, that's a whole nother conversation we could start up, but I just give to one specific example of how it's being looked at in Seattle. You know, in some ways, there's a very specific focus in the way that we're planning in the city of Seattle now about equitable development, and particularly responsive to risk of displacement, and how do you combat risk of displacement, right? Because there is a way that you could add units, build units, preserve units in the places where it is easiest to add, build, and preserve units. And those aren't either necessarily high opportunity neighborhoods, but they're also the places where there's already a lot of pressure on people who are living there, right? Near the transit station, where the neighborhood's changing a lot. So there's a conversation in Seattle about how do you both invest in those places and create opportunity there, but also talk about it at the same time as we're talking about single family zoning in the rest of the neighborhood, in the rest of the city, right? So there's a because that starts to undo the sort of history of race-based planning and discrimination that happened in the way that we zone neighborhoods, the way that we finance housing, the way that public entities have historically supported it. So I think the equitable housing, to me, is with a more intentional strategy around undoing that past history in housing.
200% agree. Affordable housing typically goes where the dirt is the cheapest.
That's
It's
right.
not necessarily where it's needed the most.
Nope.
And we are just direct response. Like high opportunity neighborhood is where the market pressure is, but it's also where there actually isn't as much affordable housing. Like it's a vicious cycle. If
Yes.
the real estate, like it's real estate 101, but typically those that new construction is where the dirt is the cheapest.
Yep.
But it's also in neighborhoods that aren't always as amenity rich. Or it's a little bit further from the things that people need. And so you're just sort of reinforcing in some ways patterns, systemic patterns.
That's right.
Of racism.
Yep.
If you're not looking at being intentional, like, and there's NIMBYism, right? Like, so in the district, to the current mayor's credit, they came out with a housing equity report. The district has updated its comprehensive plan. It's finally actually gotten approval after a struggle. But the housing equity report was about housing and affordable housing in all 8 wards. So the Ward 3, which is the west of the park, which is the sort of the whitest, the wealthiest area, that was a tough conversation. We used the color of law.
Yes.
We had conversations. We used the comp plan to kind of talk about why, like, your neighborhood doesn't look that way just because you decide, like, this, it's by design. It's not just that Black people don't want to live, Black and brown people, in a ward, and it's not just because it's expensive now.
That's
right. Historically, we were not allowed to live in those places. So I think the conversation in DC over the, since I've been back, I was pleasantly surprised at how the conversation had evolved since I had left, like, into this very sort of what I call more nuanced conversation around where should the housing go, and that, like, it really isn't just east of the river already in Black and brown communities. Yes, there are needs there, but when I was working for the planning department in DC, I was there and people were like, enough, we don't want any more. We, like, it was like, we're done. We have too much. That was the sentiment. And, and it just sort of stopped there. We didn't push when I was there around, well, what can we do in Ward 3? Because we just assumed we couldn't afford to build it. And inclusionary zoning doesn't yield the number of units, right? Like, it's you're already talking about, like, it's a set aside in a new development. And typically you're talking about 20% if you're lucky, in a new development, which could be like 8 or 10 units, depending on the size. So I'll stop there. I can go on and on, but, like,
no, I totally agree. And
housing equity is around where that affordable housing is.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a great comment in the chat that it's a self-perpetuating in a free market. I think that's true, but I think it's even worse than that, because it's not like we're starting from an actual, like, blank slate of the present, right? The deck is already stacked, so we're self-perpetuating with a stacked deck. Like, you're just going to keep. So I think it's really important to undo that. And I agree also with the next comment about public policy being, it just has to be a really sharp tool and incisive for undoing, because so much of it was so inextricably involved in that white supremacy culture that got us to where we are in our cities and the way the landscape of cities works.
But you have to have the policy, then you have to have the political leadership that would actually exercise the policy. Because
that's right.
You can have the tools on the books, you can have the legislation, and I'll just say, and Prince George's County, like, they had this first right of refusal on the book since 2013. They hadn't used it. Like, this is the first, like, it's 2021.
Right.
And we're one of 2 deals where they're actually, and what that is a way for the government to kind of intervene into a private sector deal and kind of create more affordability. So, I think a lot of times politicians like to pat themselves on the back for having created the policy. They don't always go to the next step of actually using the policies and the tools that they created. And, I'll just, we could have a whole nother session on that, Shannon. And I'm I feel a bit free because I'm not working for government for the first time in a long time to really speak honestly about that. But that's a conversation that needs to be had.
Maybe that one over wine.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will ask just one more question. As we're talking about some of these policies, are either of you, sort of aware of or kind of really honing in on or watching any examples of policies that are being put into place right now? Are there places that we can look to as sort of a best practice, or are we all sort of building this bridge as we walk over it?
I would say that DC has a lot to draw from. I would just say, though, look at the track record of success. And so TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, is one where a lot of cities are trying to develop legislation that mirrors that. And in and of itself, it's fine, but it actually hasn't been, it hasn't done what it was designed to do. And so I would say when you're looking at policies, don't adopt it wholesale, but actually look at the success and ways to tweak it, to make sure that you're doing sort of the in-depth interviewing to make sure that you don't inherit the sort of same problems with implementation. TOPA can be successful, but it hasn't been for a myriad of reasons. I think the first right of refusal is something that Arlington, especially in places that are whiter or that are, where there's the first right of refusal is really a powerful tool to ensure that the government, because a lot of this happens by right development, right? Yeah. It's by right. So government isn't necessarily involved in these projects. So to have a first right of refusal that actually there's a way for a mechanism to kind of step in. And by the way, we match the deal. The way that it works in Prince George's County is that there's a pre-qualified list of developers for profit and not for profit. When the deal comes, you cannot change it materially. So the sellers, and in this case, actually it's the Kushners, which yes, those Kushners. This project is in litigation. It's the civil law. It's actually the only one in Prince George's County. The rest of them are Baltimore, this class action lawsuit. So I was like, oh my God, we're going up against them. So I say all this to say is that around the tool, it was very effective in that we had to match it. I think the price was 45 million or something like that. We had to match that price and you have to be able to close. So you have to be able to create policy that you can use, but also understand the policy that you're adopting and whether it's been used and what the success rate is, and then make tweaks accordingly.
Right. It's not all or nothing. You can kind of cherry pick what, pieces work and yeah.
And I'll say one of the real challenges, and I think it's maybe the biggest limitation on public policy as a solution to all of this, is that all these affordable housing challenges we've talked about are market scale challenges with affordability. And our governments aren't set up on market scales, right? So regionalism is incredibly difficult. I know that's difficult in DC because the DC market covers not only the district, but 2 states and counties in both those states. I know that the Detroit landscape is balkanized by a bunch of different suburbs. Here in Seattle, we certainly see it when we build affordable housing in communities, just outside of the city of Seattle. You can get the city of Seattle to pass pretty progressive affordable housing bills, but affordable housing is a regional challenge. And we try to build an affordable housing project in a suburb and they'll pretend like they've never heard of this problem. Why are we bringing Seattle's problems to their doorstep? It doesn't naturally occur or isn't already existing where they're at, So I think we need to think at a bigger scale, and King County is trying to do that a little bit, but even King County is only one of 3 counties in our region. So I really applaud some other approaches that are at the state level, because that helps to reward good behavior by cities that are trying to take responsibility with their public policy. And, I think there also need to be some sticks for bad behavior for municipalities that aren't meeting their, their share of affordable housing needs.
Yeah, Shannon Morgan is deeply entrenched in that space here in Michigan.
Yeah, I see there's some Michigan Municipal League folks in the chat. So good luck to you. That's a challenge for our times.
Yeah. Shannon's actually an affordable housing developer who has been participating in these affordable housing coalitions around the state, and so is just really deeply entrenched in that space. So thank you. Obviously, thank you so much for joining us today. We could go on for hours, which I really think is sort of the value of these conversations, is you just get some passionate people in a room and talk about the stuff that they know best. And it's sort of this really fascinating way for us to kind of learn and engage what everybody is doing and how to sort of forge new paths forward. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you also so much to the Women's Leadership Initiative Committee here in Michigan, for Shannon Morgan and Stacy Esbrook, who have co-chaired our Women's Leadership Initiative, and really this WLI Build Up community is part of their brainchild. So thank you so much for your continued commitment. We are going to offer some breakout rooms. What we will do is we will just, if you're available to stay on, if you ladies would like to continue this conversation, I think there's about 38 of us still on the call. So, Victoria will put everybody into breakout rooms. We will just sort of wrap the meeting up right at 1 o'clock. So we're not going to come back into this space. We will just, the meeting will end. If you're still in the middle of a conversation, it might seem like it ends abruptly. But that is how we're going to do it for today. And so just give you a little bit of forewarning.
Well, before we break out, I just want to again thank you for organizing it, Shannon. And
likewise.
Jess, it was great. Definitely want to catch up with you one-on-one. So I'll reach out after this to set up some time, because it's been too long. And, great questions from the audience as well.
Yeah. And so
thanks again for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for joining. It's just been great to see your faces, and I, just miss you guys.